already talked about climaxes in musical form. Climaxes are special moments, reaching some kind of high point that we haven't heard before. They're usually underlined in some way, for example by adding an instrument that hasn't been heard before, say a cymbal crash at the peak of a crescendo. I've already discussed this kind of unique orchestral color reserved for special moments in Lesson 14 of my Applied Orchestration course here on YouTube. But there are other ways to set off special moments, like harmonic changes of focus, the equivalent of modulations in tonal harmony, or bringing in contrasting thematic material, or just adding some particularly expressive detail to the texture. The best composers always seek out such moments to enrich the listener's experience. They aren't satisfied with doing the minimum, rather they always try to give the maximum, making the music as rich as possible. And this also makes the music worth hearing more than once. Here's an example of how one can make something special. You may remember this from our last lesson. This could be improved in many ways. Listen. Here I've changed some details in the bass line and the accompanying harmony. When the dotted note figure arrives, I now have the bass move in quarter notes, making it more active. This complements the new rhythmic motive, giving the phrase, overall, more momentum. Now here's an orchestral version. Clarinet plays the main line, and the strings do the sustained accompaniment, but I've also added pizzicato basses starting with the second quarter note. This is a way of underlining the rhythmic change with the orchestration, thus reinforcing the increased momentum. The important point here is what I call the coordination principle. When several dimensions of the music work together in the same direction, the overall effect is heightened. Now let's look at a very different example, Bach's Fugue in C-sharp minor from the Waltenberg Clavier, Book 1. Here, harmony, rhythm, and texture work together to create special moments in a keyboard piece. As I've said many times before, when something happens is just as important as what happens. So in addition to noticing these special moments, we'll try to understand why Bach does them when they happen. A fugue is a contrapuntal discussion around a given subject, and sometimes a counter-subject. The voices take turns with the main material, so the listener's attention isn't always on the same part. But how can the composer keep the discussion interesting? As we will see here, Bach makes it gradually gain in intensity rather than just staying on one level. Many composers have written fugues, but Bach's fugues are musical compositions of the highest order. Let's see how he does that. Since the fugue turns around its subject, presented in the first 3 bars, let's note how the entries of the subject are prepared. For example, in measure 7, the entry in the alto voice coincides with the modulation, the natural, in the tenor, and the harmony is also dissonant when it arrives. This creates suspense. Something similar occurs in measure 12 when the soprano entry arrives. Measure 12 starts with a suspension that resolves as the soprano comes in. The tenor also has a momentary chromaticism with the D natural. The same thing happens when the next entry arrives in measure 14, and then in measure 19 when the tenor comes back with the subject. Note the rising bass line right before the entry. The modulation, here to G sharp minor, also increases the overall intensity. When another entry arrives in measure 21-22 in the tenor, the texture breathes a bit, reduced to just 3 parts. Then, right before the next entry, the top part of the bass staff in measure 24, the soprano reaches a new peak, the high B in measure 23. Then, as the tenor restates the subject, the other parts introduce eighth notes for the first time. As we can see here, the conversation between the various voices presenting the subject doesn't stay at the same level of intensity. Rather, it develops in waves, sometimes a bit more relaxed, others a bit more intense. Bach uses harmonic contrasts, rhythm, register, textural changes, and suspensions to make the entries in this conversation special events, gradually getting more and more intense. And this is why Bach is a great composer. He treats fugue like real composition, not just an exercise in counterpoint. And, as in any good composition, the music breathes, underlines special moments, and has their overall progression of intensity. As with an imaginary voyage, there are lots of new things to see and notice, and this makes the listener's experience richer.